Thank you very much to Thierry de Montbrial for inviting me to come and moderate this session. I gather you've had a fantastic series of discussions already. Our subject today is the changing political agenda and the role of think tanks in the next decade. So we're going to try and tease out some of the questions about what is a think tank, what their role is or should be, how to avoid some of the mistakes perhaps in the past, and thinking about the challenges to the roles of think tanks over the next decade. I think I'll start with a very open question to both of you. We are living at a time of instant information, disinformation, querying of elite opinion, querying of the role of experts. What do you think the role of the think tank should be going forward in the face of that sort of climate of distrust about what you or we are trying to do? Thierry, this is your institution. Perhaps I should ask you that question first.
Yes, and also we are the youngest, so it's fair to ask the youth, to speak first. We are just 40 this year, whereas the Council on Foreign Relations is going to celebrate its 100th anniversary next year, or the year after, in 21. So congratulations, my dear Richard, but I have the advantage of having been here since the beginning, whereas it is not your case. I think so. So as for think tanks, from my viewpoint, because the concept of think tank is ill-defined, and there are a number of various views on what is a think tank. But from my viewpoint and our experience at Ifri, I would say two basic things. First, I think our role, at least we are talking of think tanks specialized or focusing on international affairs, because you have think tanks, of course, who focus on other matters. The first one is that our primary task is to try and understand the world as it is. That is, to have an accurate vision of the world, that is, a capacity to analyze the reality, that realism in a non-ideological sense, that had nothing to do with cynicism, and to do so, we have to rely on professional experts, that is, people who spend their professional life in doing so. And also, since there is no universal point of view on these complex matters, the think tanks have to work together. There is a community of think tanks. We can talk about it later on. Do we, for instance, form the embryo of a civil society, world, global civil society, and so forth? We can discuss that later. But we have to work together, because I will certainly understand China better if I talk with Chinese experts. I will understand India better if I talk with Indian experts, and so forth and so on, and vice versa. And this is what we are doing. And here, for instance, we are here for the council, the meeting yesterday and today of the Council of Councils, which is a remarkable initiative of the Council of Foreign Relations, now at almost 10 years old or something like that. And we meet twice a year, once in the US and another one in another part of the world, this year in France. And these meetings are extraordinarily mutually beneficial, exactly for the reason I am trying to say. So these, and my second and briefer point is that we should try to be as non-ideological as possible, which in fact is the corollary of the first one. I personally find it hard to understand as a think tank institutions who are contributing to build ideologies. They are not, think tanks in my judgment are not ideological fabrics. But some claim to be think tanks, even though they are ideological fabrics. So I stop here for the time being.
Richard Haass, perhaps you can pick up that question in your own, with your own thoughts. How do think tanks stay relevant? What is it that what is the challenge to think tanks for the next decade?
Well, part of the answer to your question was in your question, which is the word relevance. That the think tanks have an obligation or an opportunity to be policy relevant. And in that sense, they distinguish themselves in significant part from the academy, which in many cases prides itself on being policy irrelevant, doing quantitative work or theoretical work to be detached. And particularly in the United States, think tanks have moved into that space. On the other side, though, think tanks also need to differentiate themselves from day-to-day journalism, from lobbyists, from what government says. There's a degree of perspective. And getting at something Thierry said, there's a degree of independence, that the analysis should generate the conclusions. One should not have conclusions generating or influencing the analysis, which has been known to happen once or twice. And so I think that's the general situation. I think in the current context, what's different about the positioning of think tanks is for most of our careers, and we've known each other for a good 40 years, we've both headed policy planning staffs. Think tanks operated in a world where when you got up in the morning, things were pretty predictable. They weren't all that different from the way they were when you went to sleep. There was a degree of predictability in international relations and in foreign policy. And one of the big changes that's happened, I think, in recent years, not only because of the current American administration, but in part, is the pace of change is quickened and there are fewer assumptions that are safe. And that think tanks, like every citizen, is operating in a world in which assumptions are more transient, in which there are fewer givens. And let me just make one last point and then I'll stop. When think tanks were created, particularly in the United States, the Council on Foreign Relations, Brookings, about 100 years ago, Chatham House, 100 years ago, the principal role of think tanks, indeed it was the foundation of the Council on Foreign Relations, was to be a private source of analysis and recommendation for government. The group that led to the council was a group called the Inquiry, and it was a group of experts that had been assembled to advise Colonel Haass, who was Woodrow Wilson's main advisor, as he was coming to this country for the peace conference after World War I. And this was before the era of policy planning staffs. And in some ways, what began as the Inquiry and morphed into the Council on Foreign Relations was a precursor of a policy staff. And I think our principal job over the last 100 years, I think this is true of Ifri, it's true of the Council on Foreign Relations, has been to be a source of analysis and policy prescriptions, be it for government, Congress, the executive branch, the business leadership, but what I would call the establishment or the elites. What's different now, and I think we are all adjusting to it, or determining how to adjust to it, is that still necessary, but it's no longer sufficient. And increasingly we have seen the democratization, for better and for worse, of the foreign policy conversation in all of our countries because of social media as well as other trends. So we now have a larger task or challenge, which is how do we continue to do what we've always done, have this conversation for those with power, but how do we also play a larger educational role in our respective societies at a time when nothing can be assumed. And I think that is at once the challenge, but also the opportunity for organizations such as ours.
Two things that strike me in your comments there. One is the question of time, the acceleration of time, this sense that with social media, with the where you wake up in the morning, you find a tweet from the president, and that's actually sort of changed things dramatically. And the second is this a concept of sort of hierarchy, the conversation, where does the conversation take place? Let's talk about the time first. Thierry, how does the need to take the time to reflect and to think, which is what the think tanks are all about, is there not a tension between that and the kind of acceleration of real-time foreign policy statements, if not actions? And how do you resolve that tension?
Well, first, a quasi-philosophical remark. even though there is obviously an extraordinary acceleration of time, for instance, the information technology revolution started in the 60s of last century, but it is unprecedented to have about 60 years of continuous acceleration of technological development, and it is likely that the next decade will be in that respect even more surprising than the last 60 years. So in that sense, there is an acceleration of history. But it is also true that in history, you see more often than not real discontinuities, that is in a very short period of time, you have total destruction of the previous setup and the emergence of a new one. In physics, they speak of a transition phase. And when you have a phase transition or transition phase, the new the structure which is emerging is totally unpredictable from the previous one. And therefore, yes, we have an acceleration in some sense unprecedented historically, but to use another quasi-mathematical term, catastrophes, if you mean by catastrophe almost sudden change of structure, these are relatively common things in the long term. So this being said, I think it's always useful to go back to Alfred Marshall's distinction: short-term, medium-term, long-term. And the policy horizon is medium-term, because we are not, the day-to-day policy decisions, it's the government, it's their role. The very long-term, we can say a few intelligent things, but they are not subject to immediate policy decisions. The medium term is the natural horizon of investment in the economic world, or major policy decision. For instance, if we want to build a new security system in Europe, let's say, assuming there is a need for reviewing the security system in Europe, it will take 10 years maybe. So the medium term. So our being the think tanks, the challenge for us is that we have to have enough understanding of the short term, because if we are not conscious, short-term conscious, we run the risk of being irrelevant, policy irrelevant, as Richard said. So we have to be enough short-term conscious. We have to be enough long-term conscious, in the sense that we have to be aware of the best analysis, studies, and so forth and so on for the long term. But we have to be innovative and original for the medium term. That's I think the challenge.
Richard, on this question of tension, do you agree that there is a tension there? I mean, is there a need for think tanks to be involved in the sort of daily, minute-by-minute Twitter conversation about foreign policy, or does that get in the way of thinking, of taking the sort of the medium-term perspective, as Thierry put it?
My own view is it's a risky but necessary domain for us to participate in. And let me just hasten to say, it is but one domain. And it is not the principal domain. But I describe I'm going to answer your question indirectly, and here's I always say we're in two businesses. One is we're in the business of producing and disseminating ideas, and the other is we're in the business of developing talent. Let me put aside the second, but we do a lot on that through fellowships and internship programs and so forth. But the question of ideas. So what we try to do is when I talk to our fellows, who are principal intellectual producers at the council, we think of them having a menu of vehicles. And the vehicles can range from books, and all of our senior fellows are working on books, to the other end, to tweets. So from whatever, 280 pages to 280 characters, and everything in between. And it could be articles for our magazine, say Foreign Affairs. Ifri has its magazine. It could be appearances on this or that television show, this or that radio, this speech, this congressional testimony, whatever. We have an enormous number. So to me, what you want to do is have all sorts of vehicles, because different vehicles reach different constituencies or audiences, and different vehicles can only do so much work. An op-ed of 800 words can't do the same amount of work as an article of 4,000 words as a book of 80,000 words. And you have to understand. So for me, for say, Twitter, I think it's important because the day-to-day happens. You do best in it when you draw upon your longer and larger works, that it's informed by something that's deeper. So if you're reacting to the day-to-day, you bring an added advantage, and the advantage you bring is knowledge, a sense of history, a sense of perspective. If you can somehow squeeze that into 280 characters, bully for you. That, some people are better at that. I think tankers get into trouble when they just react, and particularly when it gets ad hominem, when it gets extreme, when you sit there questioning motives. No, I always tell the people who work with us, be smart. Use your tweets or whatever, your social media, to be smart. Compete on the policy turf. That's our comparative advantage. Now the temptation is that you get lowered. Social media is not always an elevating phenomenon. And the question is how to be interesting, but stick to your values. As Thierry said, don't be ideological. I would say, don't be ad hominem. Be authoritative. It's very, the old cliche, it can take a lifetime to build a reputation, but just a minute to lose it. Understand that tweets live. So I think it's important, but it requires, in my own office, I'll just tell you, we actually, often, most of my tweets, I do all of them myself. 98% of them, I just tweet. The 1 or 2% that I think about, that tells me I'm into dangerous territory. And I have 1 or 2 people I run them by, just to give me a reaction. And we actually have an expression we call NTBT. I'm now giving away the crown jewels. The not to be tweeted account. And it's things that are dangerously clever, but the danger outweighs the cleverness. And I just don't do them. So my general view of tweeting is if you have to think about it, if you're not sure, you probably shouldn't do it.
I am a universal NTBT man.
Excellent. We've all learnt a new acronym. Let me talk a little bit about something you put your finger on earlier, Richard, which is the need to democratize and to widen that foreign policy conversation. And social media obviously is part of that. Thierry, how do you see the role of a think tank in broadening the conversation? How much, I always think back to the comment that Michael Gove made in the UK during the British referendum in 2016 about Brexit, when he said, we've all had enough of experts. And we are living in a world where that is, a reality that one has to accept about the relationship between people and elite opinion, institutional opinion. How does a think tank, what is it the job of a think tank to worry about this sort of thing? Should you be doing more to try to broaden that foreign policy conversation, to democratize, to use Richard's phrase?
Well, first, I would have some hesitations about, democratization, because it would probably take a long discussion to make sure that we understand the same thing when we use the word democratization. So let's not do it. It's a typical NT-BT issue. So, but I think what we are talking about is influence behind your question. One of the oldest issues in foreign affairs, but which is today more relevant than ever, it is the interaction between foreign and domestic politics. There has always been, even in authoritarian country, even in the French, under the French monarchy in the 18th century, for instance, we can see that the foreign policy, the French policy vis-à-vis Austria, typically in the French 18th century, was a very sensitive issue domestically. So, I mean, this has always been an issue. But today, precisely because of the social media, the acceleration of everything and so forth and so on, the immediate propagation of emotions and all these issues that we are familiar with, today it's extremely important for foreign policy experts to be very much aware of domestic politics. And domestic politics is also highly influenced, of course, by day-to-day life, by the media, and this is why what Richard calls democratization, the education. I prefer also this role, but educational role. But if I take, for instance, the interaction between think tankers and journalists, it's a very good example, because there is a community of journalists, and Sophie, you are one of them, who are extraordinarily well, not only informed, but you think, analyze, and you could be also a think tanker. You know, you have an interface between.
I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you, Tim.
No, well, whereas I would be a very bad journalist, by the way, but you could be a good think tanker. Therefore, it is this very difficult interaction between several communities that we have to learn how to be more at ease, because it is all of us together who can contribute to this democratization process. I must say that just now I don't find any better term.
Let me say something that we did at the Council on Foreign Relations. After about 85 or 90 years of our existence, we decided that everything we were doing was still necessary, but it was no longer sufficient. And I don't know to what extent it's American uniquely or more broad. My hunch is a bit of both, but we were noticing through opinion polls that polls measuring what Americans knew about international relations and foreign policy was quite modest in many ways. And you could graduate from virtually any university in the country. And even though the courses were offered, they were not required. So you could get a bachelor's degree or master's degree and be essentially illiterate about the world you were entering, and that was going to affect your life fundamentally. And that obviously doesn't even begin to capture all those Americans who don't go to college. In high school, it's very rare indeed to be exposed to these studies. The major media had reduced the number, say, of international bureaus. And what was happening is, whether it was on social media or cable television, Americans were increasingly selecting those outlets that reinforced either their political instincts or their interests. So if their interests were not international, they weren't getting exposed to it, yet the votes they were casting or not casting would have enormous consequences for the country and the world. And so what we decided to do, starting about 10 years ago, was we actually changed our mission statement. We added the word education to it. And that we said, in addition to everything we do at the Council on Foreign Relations, we are going to take on a large educational role. And we've become probably now the biggest producer of educational material for American high schools and colleges, teaching them about the world. On our website, cfr.org, the area that people spend the most time on are what are called explainers or backgrounders. What is a tariff? Who are the Kurds? So when news happens, it's a place that people can go to get the necessary background. We'll be doing events all over the country next year. Why? We want to have foreign policy forum in many of the critical primary states, so voters and local journalists are more aware of what questions maybe they should ask of the candidates, because the next president, whether it's Mr. Trump or a Democrat, is going to be the commander-in-chief, and everything he or she does or doesn't do has consequences. We spend a lot of time, turns out about 150 million Americans, I'll stop with this, but about 150 million Americans every week go to a house of worship, to churches, mosques, synagogues. And we said, okay, why don't we become a resource for the people giving the sermons? So now we work with religious leaders in our country and congregational leaders to make them better informed. So what should a religious leader say on a given Sunday about climate change? Why might this be relevant to those people who are in his or her church? So what we're trying to do is find ways of staying true to our mission, but finding different ways, basically doing work at different levels. Because for some cases, if I were writing for Thierry, I could assume virtually everything. But if you're writing other people, you can't. And then you have to spend a lot of time marketing. We have to increasingly run think tanks like businesses. We can't assume that just because we produce quality work, people read it or hear it. So it's a much more competitive environment as well for us, but we need to adapt.
Yes, I'd like to add something, this idea of illiteracy about foreign policy, foreign affairs issues among people who otherwise belong to the elites. I can give you two examples. Well, the first example is myself. Now, I was trained as a mathematician. My PhD in the United States is in pure mathematical economics. My first works and books were in totally mathematical economic theorizing, and people who read some of my works will find even now the traces of this. But in fact, I'm very happy to have been illiterate in foreign affairs at the beginning of my career, because precisely it helps me understand what it means to be illiterate, which is important. The second illustration I can give you, I was very much struck at I think it was in 1991, I visited Algeria. And I talked with some Islamic Front people, very interesting people, nice people, by the way, men and women, and extremely educated. They were all engineers. They had people with technical background, and they, as in foreign policy, they were totally, or in politics in general, totally ideological, And in the United States also, when I was a student, by the way, in the same building, we had some Iranian students at the time, and many of those found themselves in Iran after the revolution. The same scheme, people who are very well educated as technicians or engineers. And these people are the ideal praise to ideologues. And I think we could multiply such examples. So we should also remember that in our work, because it obviously has illiteracy, to use the word again, has huge consequences.
I think let's look at the next decade and bring up I'd like to bring up a different subject. Looking ahead, probably the fastest growing market, if you can call it that, or the fastest growing source of think tanks is going to be China. It already is. I think it's the second greatest number of think tanks in the world after the US. Very complicated. How do you build relationships or not with think tanks that are or institutions, organizations that are called think tanks in China? How does that relationship work? Richard, should we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one has to accept what they are, but also what they are not. People can do original work in these institutions. They can do policy relevant work, but it all has to take place within certain boundaries. There is no truly civil society in China. The government reaches everyone and every entity, be it a business, a non-governmental organization, or an individual. that divide, if you will, between governmental authority and power in the rest of the society is, to some extent, does not exist in China. So you have to accept that. Doesn't mean there's not work of value. It doesn't mean it doesn't give you insight into Chinese thinking or Chinese options, but one shouldn't kid oneself. It's truly bounded work, or it will become a former think tank or a former employee with great rapidity. And I would just say, I actually think it's a weakness for China. One of the, I come from a country which, shall we say, is known for its mistakes. I get it. One of the advantages of democracies in places where you have truly civil society and think tanks is the ability to self-correct. One of the biggest problems for China going forward is, I think, its ability to self-correct is circumscribed. One of the reasons is that there aren't entities, individuals, or organizations with China that can speak truth to power, and that could say, this one-child policy we just adopted years ago, this is a big mistake, because the day is going to come when the ratio of working age to non-working age is going to be terrible, and the pressures it's going to place on our social safety net are going to be enormous. This is really a bad idea, but because those arguments weren't or couldn't be made in such a way that they might be heeded, China in a decade is going to pay an enormous price. It's already begun to, for a one-child policy. So I think one probably shouldn't use the phrase think tanks when one speaks of China, or should put it in quotes.
Thierry.
Well, yes, I agree to some extent, but only to some extent to what Richard says. In fact, I have observed over more than 40 years, even now 46 years since the beginning of the policy planning staff, having had hundreds like you of even perhaps thousands of conversations with Chinese, Russian, Soviets at the time, think tankers. More often than not, I was struck by the relevance of their analysis and remarks, including their own analysis on ourselves. I think they are precisely because they are trained they are asked to analyze us as objectively as possible, because they are supposed to help, their leadership for their decisions. So, of course, when it comes to talking about their domestic affairs, a totally different situation. Now, and in the case of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union collapsed, many people who became, who helped for the transformation into a more open country, came actually from think tanks. Particularly in the banking world, that's very, in the case of Russia, but a number of former think tankers who adapted very easily, precisely because they had this relatively good understanding of us. But of course, if we criticize rightly the think tanks from authoritarian countries, for the reasons Richard mentioned, the question comes, and maybe you would have raised it yourself, the degree of independence of Western think tanks. That's a question we are asked almost every day, because we have to be funded. So the question there is a different kind of question that has to be discussed openly. How is it possible to get money and nevertheless to remain independent? That's, I think, the big problem, especially in countries where the foundation system is totally underdeveloped, which is the case in Europe in general and in France in particular. So I think that the life of think tanks today is in the West at large is particularly difficult, because we have to live, to be funded, and we have also to be very rigorous in what we can accept and not accept in order to remain intellectually independent. To remain intellectually independent, that is, to remain objective, clear-minded, and not to have biases either for political or for financial reasons.
Richard, do you want to come back on that point?
Yeah, just two things. One is I agree with your point what you said about, say, Chinese think tanks. The more they're looking, or Russian think tanks, or Soviet think tanks in the old days, the more they're looking at outsiders, probably the more valuable the work. I don't think now, though, a Chinese think tank could be expected to do an insightful critique of policy towards Hong Kong or the South China Sea, or the wisdom of the abolition of term limits. It's just, you know, it's just not realistic. So again, but their analysis of American foreign policy, yes, I'm sure that I actually read them, and I find them interesting, and it's quite useful. In terms of funding, yeah, I think Thierry said an important point about 15, 20 minutes ago when he talked about the ideological threat. In the United States, you can qualify as a tax-free entity, which we use the technical phrase of 501c3, but you can also be very ideological. You could just not hire people or publish people whose views fall in a certain part of the political spectrum. Those are very predictable places where, again, I would say, in many cases, the conclusions generate the analysis. I don't have a whole lot of respect for them, but they exist. I think we are more fortunate in the U.S. given our taxing system, the tradition of philanthropy. You know, we're in a position where we don't accept government money. We have distributed funding from members, from corporations, from foundations, from our magazine. So, you know, we're lucky, but I do think it's important for political independence that one aspires to as much distributed funding as you can. You don't, almost like universities, you don't allow individual givers to dictate, for example, who sits in a chair or what work is done. You separate funding from product. You have to be transparent, particularly where you have to compromise. If it turns out that the only way you can exist is by taking X% of your funds from a certain source, then you've got to say so. And then set up procedures where, again, the source of the money does not have direct influence over what it is you do. And if for people, but you've got to admit at least the connection to take away the argument that somehow you're hiding it.
Transparency presumably it has to be a big part of this. Well, one thing I'd just love to hear both of you talk about a little bit is it's something perhaps a little French, but it's the French think tank landscape has just changed immeasurably. I mean, when you started Ifri, there was almost nothing. Now there are a number of think tanks. Is there something? How do you compare the French and the American think tank landscape? It's there's a very different political culture here, a very different state culture, a different understanding of organizations outside the state. How do you compare America and France in that respect?
Well, it is very different. First of all, because the French and American cultures, in fact, in these policy matters, are really very, very different. And this is why I always say to my French friends who pretend to understand the United States, I warn them. Personally, the more I have known the United States, the more I have discovered that I do not know the United States. You see, you can say that because it is a different, fascinating world, and I always, for instance, when talking with my friends, let's say Richard Haass or a number, I could mention a few others, I always learn something. It's not that I learn, of course I can learn something factually, but it is not what I mean, in the way of thinking, of approaching, so we are different. Take one concrete example, which is state funding. Well, in France, you do not have foundations anyway. So in the case of Ifri, I can tell you that we have exactly 23% of our resources which come from the government, okay? But where do they come from? I have fought many years, especially at the beginning, to have this at the equivalent of a foundation, because that was for instance, I fought at the beginning of Ifri for that money to come not from the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Minister of Defense or whatever, but for the Prime Minister's office and voted by Parliament. And there is no strings attached. It is a very general contract saying just to help develop understanding the world better and so forth and so on. But at the beginning, it was 50%, the rate of dependence. Now it is 23%, and this building where you are was funded 100% by private donations, which is totally unique in France, totally unique in France. But now, at this point, first, I think because we have fought for independence, we had at least one major crisis under any president, Hollande included. We have won all our crises. And today, I can tell you that we are highly respected, and no one in the government would even try to force us into this or that direction. They have understood. So it's a matter of reputation. It takes decades to build, and it could be reversed in a minute, as Richard said a few minutes ago, if you make a big mistake. But my last point on this is that today I wouldn't go below my 23%. Why? Because the fact that we are in fact close also to the government, in the sense that we have access, not only do we have access to everyone, but vice versa. You know, they consult us constantly on various matters. This means that we are relevant, to use this term again, and even our foreign friends, they are happy to work with us precisely because we are relevant. So you see, it is a very subtle chemistry. And for average American intellectual or policymaker, this is quite difficult to understand this sort of chemistry. So here we are in France, we are talking about the US and France, but if we go in other parts of Europe, we would have different schemes, all of them, in fact, different. That's part of the charm of our work.
Richard, is there anything particularly that strikes you about the European or the French landscape in terms of what's changed in think tank world? And I suppose one thing that, one part of that difference is the sort of rotating door in the US between policy making and think tank work is much less common, certainly in France. I mean, what sort of differences strike you in that respect?
Well, the last point you raise is true, but that's probably, that goes beyond think tanks. It's just, in the United States, you never have to decide what you're going to do when you grow up. And you can constantly, you have options of going in and out of government in ways that you really don't have in many other countries. And I would say that's both a strength and at times not such a strength when I look at some of the ambassadors we've had over the years. I wish there were a few more barriers to entry in some cases. The thing I'm struck with, the first think tank I ever worked in was a European think tank, was the Institute for Strategic Study. Actually, I'm so old, it was the ISS, not the IISS, when I worked there in the 70s. One thing is I'm simply struck by how there's more European organizations and entities, not just national ones, and there's a few more. But still, the difference between the United States and Europe, if one looks at our populations, there's enough similarity. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of think tanks. We have proliferated think tanks on a scale that is quite stunning. Some good ones have risen in recent years, particularly that are more focused, that don't try to do everything or don't try to do all of foreign policy, but maybe just do economics or just do this or that region or this or that issue like immigration or development. So we're seeing greater specialization. But beyond that, no, I think we face, and I thought Thierry's comments were really interesting about the different ways to think about funding. For us, it's essential. When I got to the council saying, we do not take government money, I thought that was an important message about independence. But it's interesting, you know, you make, as you would say, a subtle point that didn't go completely by me about the relationship here. Because if you do want to be relevant, you do have to stay close enough to the government so you know what's going on and you know where there are opportunities to have influence. But my biggest sense in the US is just the sheer number, and I think I worry a little bit about the lack of, shall I say, I'll get in trouble for this, but the lack of quality, and a lot of places are calling themselves think tanks but really aren't. And a lot of them are simply camouflage lobbying organizations, are not doing deeply analytical or intellectually honest work in some cases. And now that's dangerous simply because, it's something you mentioned at the beginning, we're in this atmosphere where there's such suspicion of authority, an unwillingness to accept facts even when they are, or to call things facts even when they are not. So I actually think all of us rise and fall on the behavior and quality of all of us. So I worry when I see things that diminish respect for these organizations, that we all get tarred with a brush. So I think one of the bigger threats to this enterprise is that a lot of organizations have now joined this field, and there's no licensing requirements, in a sense. Anybody can start a think tank, and I worry about some of what I see.
I think we've probably got to the end of our session. We've run over time, but we did start a little bit late. There's so much there. There's fantastic conversation. Thank you, both of you, very much indeed. I think a round of applause is well due.